All right, welcome to building single page apps with Angular, ASP.NET Core, and OpenAPI. Today I'm going to show you the simplest approach, and the simplest approach means I'm going to take all of the pain away. When you're starting with Angular, you know that's a lot to manage. When you're starting with ASP.NET Core, that's a lot to manage. Then when you bring them together, that can be a nightmare. So I'm going to show you how to do that really quickly, really efficiently, and not have to worry about it. And it's so simple that it's going to improve actually the whole story. It's going to improve your development, it's going to improve your release to testing, it's going to improve your release to production. It simplifies the whole story. Now, the next challenge that new developers face is how do I actually wire up my back end to my front end? How do I get those view models across? How do I actually access my API from Angular? I'm going to make that really simple too. I'm going to make that so that you don't have to worry about that anymore. It's just going to happen for you. So let's get started. I'm Jason Taylor, and I'm an SSW solution architect. You can find me on Twitter at JasonGTAU or on my blog, codingflow.net. Now, I've been a developer since 1992. I developed from 1992 to 1993 until I found out that you could play games on the Commodore 64. I then played games until 2001 and then started programming with .NET, and I've been programming professionally with .NET since then, pretty much since the initial release of .NET. So today, there's a couple of prerequisites you'll need for getting started. The first is .NET Core 2.1 release candidate. Now you can follow this link and download it here, and later on throughout the day you can come and see me and I can help you get started. The next thing you need, and pretty much the only other thing you'll need, is Node.js, so version 8.1.1 or higher. Now with those two things, you're free to build these single page apps using your favorite OS, so Windows, Mac, Linux, your favorite IDE, so Visual Studio, Rider, Notepad, whatever your preference is. Of course, if you're wanting to use Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio 2017, as a lot of us do at SSW, then you'll want to check out this link. Also worth noting, there's Visual Studio for Mac. So if we have those things in place and we want to create a new single page application with Angular and ASP.NET Core, we only have to remember three things. Actually, sorry, I meant to say, we're using release candidate software today, 2.1, but it's supported by Microsoft and ready for production use, so you feel free to go live with that. Go live license, and in 2 to 3 months, the release to manufacturing will be available. So as I was saying, you only need to remember three things, and that's .NET New Angular. You can take that away today, and you'll be able to build a single page app using Angular and ASP.NET Core, and you won't have to worry about how do I wire those two things up. Let's have a look at that in action. So I'll open a command prompt here, and this is just an empty folder. Is that text big enough for everyone? Okay, good. So a couple of things I like to do to get in the zone. First thing is change the prompt, and the second thing is change the color. Because if we're going to start hacking, we need a green text on a black screen. So then we can just go .NET New. We can have a look at what's available. When we type .NET New, there's basically going to show us all of these templates that are available that we can create.
Can you make it smaller the window, because we don't see the full screen? Yeah.
Okay. That's better? Cool.
That's a Surface Book thing.
It's a Surface Book thing?
It's not in the...
Okay, something weird. No problem. But you can see here, there's basically 3 SPA templates that we can start with. There's Angular, there's React, and there's React and Redux. Now today we're all about Angular, so let's go ahead and type .NET New Angular. So what that does is that creates a new application for us with an Angular front end and an ASP.NET Core backend, and they're wired up together so that we don't have to worry about it. Now it's also restored our NuGet packages, so we don't need to do that. Now if this was the first time that you were running this command, a new feature of ASP.NET Core 2.1 is it has HTTPS enabled by default, and it would actually give you some instructions to trust the dev certificate. They give you a dev certificate so that when you're programming in development, you're programming with HTTPS enabled, and that means that when you go to production, it won't be the first time you're testing your app with HTTPS enabled. So that's a good thing. So the next thing that we need to do is actually jump into this client app folder, and it contains our Angular application, and we'd run npm install. But if I do that, we're going to run out of time because it's going to download the entire internet, and that'll be the end of the demo. So let's switch to one that I created a bit earlier, and it's basically the same thing. This time we're going to open it in Visual Studio Code because that's where I like to do a lot of my front end work. So just zoom that in a bit. Okay, so you can see in this application, the first thing you'll note is we have a folder called Client App. Now that contains our Angular app, and it is actually an Angular CLI app, which is great. So you've got the full support of the Angular community. Now, if you have some other Angular CLI app that you want to generate in there, or you want to blow away what's created as part of this template, you can do that. Just delete the contents, run ng-new with whatever options and arguments you require, and you're good to go. They're not tightly coupled. The next thing you'll have is your controllers. So you see here we have a nice sample data controller that can help us get started. And then we have our CS proj, so we can see all of the dependencies for the ASP.NET Core app. And in our client app, you'll have everything that you expect from Angular. So why don't we run that and have a look at the sample app. So to run it, it's simple. We just go .NET run, and that does two things. That starts Kestrel, which is a web server for ASP.NET Core, and that's started now, so we can control click on this URL. And the second thing that will happen is it will start Angular CLI, so it'll host the Angular app using ng-serve, and we don't have to worry about that. So really, .NET new Angular and .NET run gets us up and running with Angular and ASP.NET Core, gets us developing. We're good to go. So let's have a look at what you get when you run .NET new Angular. Basically, you get a sample application, and this sample application includes a page which shows you information about the project that's being built, the technologies it's using. It provides an example of a simple Angular component, and it also provides an example of an Angular component which makes a call to the backend server. It's taking a little while to start, and that's because it's running ng-serve for the first time. So ng-serve is building those client-side dependencies, and then it's going to host that application. So that's finished now, and you can see all of those requests coming through, and the application is loading. So I'll zoom in a bit here. Here we go. So this is the page that tells you everything about the project that we've just built. It's built on ASP.NET Core with C#, Angular and TypeScript, and it's got Bootstrap for layout and styling. It's got improvements from your traditional Angular app. It's got improved client-side navigation, so an easy experience between the back end and the front end. Angular CLI integration, which is a big bonus, and efficient production builds. And when they talk about efficient production builds, they're talking about you can run .NET publish, and it will package that application in one package, and you can ship it through the DevOps pipeline in one package. It's really simple. So then you have a simple Angular component. We've got our counter, we can increment that. And then we've got our fetch data component, which actually goes back to ASP.NET Core Web API, fetches data from the server, and displays it on the screen. So pretty simple. Now let's have a look at one thing that we can do to make this even better, and that's to implement the Open API specification. So show of hands, who's heard of Open API? Okay, just maybe 5 of us. Okay, but who's heard of Swagger? Okay, cool, half of us, yeah. So it's formerly known as Swagger, and it's used to describe the capabilities of web APIs. It allows both humans and computers to better understand a service. So what we do is we'll generate an Open API specification document for our service, and that means that developers can understand our service better, and computers can understand our service better. And by computers understanding our service better, well, if a computer can understand it, then it can generate code based on our service. So a couple of the things that we're going to do is we're going to generate documentation for our service, and we're going to generate clients for our service. And what type of clients could we generate? Well, anything. We could generate a C# client or a TypeScript client. And today I'm going to demonstrate generating a TypeScript client. So when you're doing these sort of things with the Open API specification, the typical approach is to use a tool such as Swagger, NSwag, or Swashbuckle. Now I prefer to use NSwag because NSwag has that advanced client generation capabilities. So let's have a look at that in action. So the first thing that you'll need to do is to add a reference to NSWAG ASP.NET Core. So to do that, I'll open up the CS project and you can see that I've added it here. Now if you're using Visual Studio, you can do that through your package manager, or you can just edit the CS project directly. I like to edit the CS project directly because it's nice and easy to work with and I can type it in and I know exactly what's happening. So that's in place. The next thing you need to do is go to Startup and you'll need to add a couple of using statements. So you'll need to add system.reflection, JSON schema, and NSWAG ASP.NET Core. And then it's just a matter of configuring NSWAG. So if we scroll down a little bit, you can see right here, and I'll just make that a bit bigger. Right here, we're saying use Swagger UI. So that's telling NSWAG to actually generate the OpenAPI specification and to actually display a UI that's generated based on that specification. So we'll have a look at that UI right now. To access it, I can just type Swagger at the end of this application and it will show us Swagger UI. So there's two things that have happened. There's our OpenAPI specification document, which describes our service. Now at the moment, it's just the weather forecast service, but it tells us how we can get some weather forecasts, and it also tells us some of the objects, some of the view models or DTOs that we can expect to be returned from the service. Now based on that, we can make it easier for humans to understand our service. So we use Swagger UI to describe our service, and you can see here it says we've got a sample data service with a weather forecast action. If we click on that, it tells us about this action. It says, okay, the typical response is 200, okay, and it's going to return data that's kind of in this shape. It's going to have a date, it's going to have a temperature, a summary, and a temperature in Fahrenheit. And we can also try it out. So if we hit this button, it actually makes a call to our service, even though we haven't necessarily created any logic for that yet. It makes a call to our service and returns the results. So a developer can explore Swagger UI and they can learn about the API that you've built for them and they can incorporate it into their applications. So with that in place, that's generating the OpenAPI specification and setting up Swagger UI. There's just one more thing that you'll need to do so that you can access it. You just need to wrap this use sparse statement, which is a part of the routing, to say, hey, if it starts with Swagger, if I say localhost/Swagger, then don't do anything. And that just allows that Swagger UI to load. So that's pretty simple. Now, with those things in place, that's basically our backend setup. But we want to use that information to generate a TypeScript client on our front end, because there's a lot of things that are being reproduced on our front end. Let me show you some of those things. There's a fetch data component in Angular. So we're making this HTTP client call to our weather forecast service, but we're having to write all of that ourselves. That's code that we're writing. In addition, we're also duplicating our DTO. That DTO is already defined on the server side, but we're creating it again here. I don't want to do any of those things, so let me show you how we can avoid that altogether. So the first thing we need is to grab another NSWAG package, but this time we're doing it on the client side. So in our Angular app, in our package.json, we go ahead and add this NSWAG npm package, and that allows us to use the NSWAG CLI on the client side. Now, what we need to do then is generate a configuration file so that we can generate it on the client side. So to do that, typically what I'll do is I'll fire up NSWAG Studio, which is yet another tool. And you can see here, and I'll just zoom in a little bit there, I'm pointing it at the Swagger specification document that we've already created. And what I've done is I've gone to this TypeScript client page and I've told it, this is what I want. I want to use TypeScript version 2.4 and I want to generate an Angular client. I want you to use the HTTP client and I want you to use the injection token. I've said, hey, name my services that you generate, controller name service. So sample data service in this case. And the other important thing, there's lots of options that you can figure and play with, but the other important thing is I've said, when you finish doing that, I want you to drop the TypeScript client into my Angular application. So that's what it does. So now, with all of that in place, I can run that from the client. So if I bring up my terminal again, I'll just make that a little bit bigger. New window. Okay, so if I just jump into my Angular app, all I have to do is type nswag run, because I've got my configuration file, my nswag configuration file, which I created using the nswag studio. So if I run that, that goes ahead and generates that client for me. And now we can find that in source, app, services, and Northwind. So this client includes everything that I need to communicate with my backend. I don't have to write this code by hand anymore. It's being created for me, and it's being created from the single source of truth, my backend. That's where I've defined my web API, and that's where I've defined my DTOs. Now, if we scroll down a little bit, here's that weather forecast DTO. I don't have to create it anymore. It's being generated based on code that's in the backend. So now we can just go ahead and update that fetch data component. I've already wired in this service. So what I might do is I'll make it really easy. I'll grab this one that I've already created. We'll just copy that, and we'll jump back here, and we'll have a look at this. So this one, fetch data component. So I just want you to see. So here, we're injecting the HTTP client. We're also injecting a URL for our website. Then we're actually calling a HTTP GET request. We're getting the results of that forecast, and we've defined a DTO. Instead of that, we can do this. We can inject our sample data service, which was generated on our TypeScript client. We can inject our weather forecast DTO, which was generated also, and all we have to do is make a single call. This.sampleDataService weather forecast subscribe. We get a collection of forecasts, and that's available on our back end. So if I save those changes, and we'll see Angular spin that up again. And if I come over here, we can come here, and it all works the same. And we've taken out all of the pain with working with Angular and ASP.NET Core together. So I've got some recommended resources for you. The first one is the project template docs. So the project template, .NET New Angular, that I used to build this application, you can learn a lot more about that there, plus some advanced features. The next one is the Angular documentation. If you're new to Angular, you definitely want to check this out. And this documentation is a gold mine. Just go from start to finish, read it all, and then start building Angular apps. Bootstrap docs, if you're new to Bootstrap, you're definitely going to want to check that out because this template uses Bootstrap. And finally, the NSWAG documentation. That'll show you a lot of the tools and techniques that I use today. I'll just go back one step, so if you want to take a photo, but you can definitely come and talk to me today, and I can show you how to get up and running with all of these tools and techniques.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome. As you all know, it's very difficult to create an application the first time without any bugs in it. And although there's some ways that we can prevent introducing bugs like TDD and defensive programming, it's virtually impossible to not introduce any bugs into your application as you're developing it. So having some skills on debugging an application, especially in Angular if you're new to it, can make you more efficient and productive in developing your application and also debugging any bugs that are in there. So today I'm going to show you 7 techniques that I use when developing Angular applications to debug them. A bit about me first. I'm Barry Sanders. I'm a full stack developer at SSW. When I'm not coding, I can usually be found in the kitchen, baking cakes or pastries, something like that. So happy to talk about baking as well as Angular. The topics I'm going to cover today are how you can leverage TypeScript to reduce introducing bugs into your application, how you can pipe information from your components to your browser, how you can output information to the browser console, there's a really cool extension called Augury that you can use to get some visual some visual information about the components. Also going to cover stepping through the TypeScript code, using Angular's error handler, and also if you use NGRX, how to use the NGRX DevTools. The screenshots that I'm showing in the talk today are taken from Todd Motor's NGRX store and effects demo application, and I provided the links there if you want to have a look at it later. He's also got a paid for course on NGRX. That's a really good introduction to NGRX if you're not already using it. Okay, so firstly, leveraging TypeScript. When we're developing, we want to use all the tools available to us to reduce introducing bugs accidentally. And TypeScript provides strong typing of your JavaScript application, your JavaScript components, so that you avoid introducing typos. So, for example, in this slide, you can see down the bottom I've got a pizza that's just typed as any. And I can then very accidentally introduce a bug by not using the correct the correct name for the property. So that's not good. So instead, using TypeScript, you can create a model for your pizza and then strongly type your pizza object. And then if you use the wrong name for your property, your compiler will trap that. So that's much better. So where possible, you should use TypeScript to reduce introducing mistakes and bugs into your application. Second, piping to the browser. In your HTML template in your Angular component, you can take one of your objects, say the pizza, and use the JSON pipe. And using interpolation, you can print that out to the window, to the browser window. So by putting that into your code, you'll have this printed out to your browser. And you can very easily then see what the properties of your component are on the screen. Okay, another technique is writing information out to the browser console itself. So that's the developer console. The standard way of doing this is to use console.log, and you can put a message in there, and you can also put any objects on there as well. And for an example, if we logged out the form control, then in the console window, you'd see the information that you logged out, so the message as well as the information about the object that you've logged. And you can drill down into that. In addition to using console.log, you can use console.warning or console.error. With the warning, you'll get the information highlighted in yellow, and with the error, you'll get it highlighted in red. Something that isn't very well known is that Angular provides a function called probe that you can use in the dev mode of your application. And what that does is if you're running your application, you go to the Elements tab in the dev console of the browser, select the element that you want to look at in particular. You'll notice that there's a little $0 at the end here. If you then go to the console tab and you type in $0, you'll actually get that element, and you can drill down into it. So that's the HTML element. If you put ngprobe $0 and you look at the component instance information, that will actually give you all the information about the objects and events in your Angular component. So that's going to match what you've got, what you've defined in your component itself. So for instance, there's an input, which is a pizza, and then in the console, you'll have the pizza object printed out to the screen there. So this is really useful. You don't have to put anything into your code itself to find out information about the component. You can just go to the browser, type in ngprobe $0 component instance, and it works like magic. One interesting thing is if you put $1, that will give you the parent of the object you're looking at, or $2, the parent of parent. So if you're really deep in your objects, you can go back. The Augury extension is an extension that's available for Chrome, and that can be downloaded at this URL. It will give you a visual representation of almost the same thing that ng$0 component instance gives you. You can drill down into it, you can look at the parents, so it just saves a bit of time. I have found, though, that on very large applications, it sometimes crashes, so it works very well with small applications. The other good thing about Augury is that it provides a second tab with the router tree in it, so you've got a visual representation of your routes, and it will also show you which ones are lazy loaded. And there's also an NG modules tab, which will show you all your modules, and then within each, what's being imported, exported, what's being provided as a service in that component. It can be helpful to track down an error. Okay, sometimes, yeah?
Sorry, could you repeat please the name of the last?
Sure, let me go back. It's called Augury.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. These slides will be available on the site afterwards, so grab it from there. So sometimes it's necessary to actually step through your code if there's a bug to find out where that bug's occurring. And there's a couple of techniques to do that. But before you do that, if you're using TypeScript, you have to enable source map. Otherwise, if you're running the application, you'll get the compiled JavaScript. If you put a breakpoint in, you actually want to look at your TypeScript that you've been using. So you have to enable source map in the tsconfig.json file. If you're using the Angular CLI, that's enabled by default, but if you find that you're wondering where your TypeScript is, check that that's enabled. So the first method that you can do to break in your code is to write debugger into your TypeScript. If you're using tslint, that will sometimes warn you against doing that, and you might have to overwrite that tslint warning. The second option is to find your source in the DevTools console itself under sources, and then you can drill down into your local host, and you can put a breakpoint on the line you're interested in. But is there a better way to do this? Because in the first instance, you've got to write something into your code itself, and you might forget to take it out. And secondly, it could be dangerous leaving it in there. And then also putting a breakpoint in the console itself of the browser isn't very efficient because you've got to keep switching back and forth between your browser and your VS Code to make the change and then go back and see if it's fixed. So a better way or more efficient way of doing it is to, if you're using VS Code, is to install VS Code debugger for Chrome. I think by default it's installed already. No. Okay. It's a very good one to install if you haven't already. And what that allows you to do is to use the debugging tab in VS Code itself. So after you've installed it, you go to the debugging tab. You then click on the gear and click on Chrome to configure the extension to work in Chrome. Make sure that the URL is set to your URL and port that you're using to run it locally. And make sure that the web root is also pointing to where your source files are, your TS source files. Then you can put the breakpoint directly in your VS Code. And when you run the application using start debugger or debugging from VS Code, it will then break at that point in your code. You can also, in VS Code extension, you can set it to break at exceptions. So if there is an exception in your code, it will just automatically break at that point and can help you track down the error. So I just introduced an error here to demonstrate that. Okay, so that using the VS Code debugger for Chrome gives you a much better and efficient workflow. Okay. The next one that I was going to talk about is the global error handler in Angular. So Angular defines an error handler by default as part of the Angular core library. And what that does is it will automatically print out error message to your console. So you'll see that already. If there's a runtime error in the application, it will print it out to the console. It's possible to override this custom error handler. And for example, you could override it to pop up a toaster message or to log out to a server. You could even email yourself if you wanted to, which probably isn't a good idea. Get thousands of emails. Just going to show you an example where I've installed a few third-party NPM packages. Structured log is a logging service, and then structured log for seek sync is an extension of that will log out to a seek server, and then also NGX toaster, which will do pop-ups. So I've created a logger service using structured log and seek sync. So when the logger is constructed, it will create a structured log object, and it will bind it or port it out to seek sync. So when the error is logged, it's going to log that out to seek. Then the next thing to do is to create an override of the global error handler that's available in Angular. You do that by extending the error handler. So creating a service again, extending the error handler. And in this error handler, I've now injected toaster and also the logging service that I created. And then finally, in your app module, you tell Angular to use your global error handler that you've created and override the default one that's there. Then if you do come across an error, what happens is, in this example, you'll get a toast error pop-up. You'll get the default action, which is logging out to the console, and it will also log out to your seek server. Okay. The final topic that I wanted to cover is using NGRX tools. So how many of you are using NGRX at the moment? So, only a few, okay. NGRX is a really good state management library for Angular. And when you're working large applications, it gives you a central place for managing all the state across your whole application. It can be difficult to debug, and these tools give you a really good way of debugging NGRX. So this assumes that you've got NGRX installed and you're using it in your application. There are 3 steps for using the NGRX tools themselves. The first is to install the extension in your browser. Second is to install and second and third is to install and configure it in your application. So to install the Chrome Redux DevTools extension, you go to this URL. Then in your Angular application, you'd install the package, and you configure it to be used in your application. And then you'll know it's running. If you run your application and you go to the console of your browser, there'll be a Redux tab. On the left, it gives you all the actions that are taking place consecutively in your application, all the dispatches to NGRX actions. And then from the inspector, you can look at each action, so what's being sent to NGRX. You can look at the state at the point in time of each of those actions, and you can look at the difference between the current action and the previous action. There's also a really cool what they call a time traveler line, so you can switch back and forth between actions that have happened. So, for example, if I hit back here, you can see that the pizza toppings disappear. If I hit forward again, they reappear. So it's removing and redispatching that action. Okay. So the 7 items that I covered today were leaving TypeScript. So make sure you strongly type your objects. Pipe out to the browser using the JSON pipe. Write out to your console using ngprobe or console log. Install the Augury extension, which gives you a visual representation of the objects. Install Visual Chrome extension, a debugger extension, which will allow you to step through your code. And you can override the Angular's default error handler with your own logging if you want to. And if you're using NGRX, make sure you install the tools. Okay, so go out there and create bug-free software. Thank you.
So my name is Brendan. I'm a solution architect here at SSW. Yes, going. Based in Brisbane. And I'm going to talk to you about state management in Angular because I'm going to introduce a new state management. Someone's already mentioned NGRX, but there's now a new choice that's fairly recently released called NGXS. And I'm going to talk about the difference between them and you know, the fact that you can make a choice now. But I'm going to start with an introduction because obviously we did a quick show of hands. Not many people are using NGRX, so I'm going to try and explain both. And we'll start with why we mess around with these frameworks. And the real reason we mess around with frameworks and do architecture is spaghetti code. So in spaghetti code, the relations between the pieces of code are so tangled that it's nearly impossible to add or change something without unpredictably breaking something somewhere else. Does that sound familiar to anyone in the room? Yeah, and no one sets out to make spaghetti code. You think, right, this time this new project, I'm gonna make it nice and clean. I'm gonna make it right this time. And then you start making some stuff and it's looking beautiful. And then halfway through the project, a new requirement comes in that you didn't know about at the start of the project. And you go, oh, right, we've got to make this work. We haven't got the time. So you start cutting some corners and wiring up bits that shouldn't have been wired together. And eventually you'll end up with spaghetti code. So the idea of this architecture is to eliminate, or not to eliminate, but to try and mitigate the impact of spaghetti code. So one thing with all these JavaScript applications and these JavaScript user interfaces, if you take spaghetti code and put them through the blender that is asynchronous events, what you can quite often end up with is what's called mutable soup. Anything can change anything somewhere else at some point in the application and you end up with this mess, this sea of stuff that is the data inside your application. So for me, the role of software architecture is to impose artificial constraints in order to promote consistency and predictability. And the Redux pattern is the most constrained platform I've used to do that. So the Redux pattern is interesting because it's a design pattern that is growing across across lots of platforms. So for me, it doesn't really matter whether you're doing Angular or React, for example, but it makes a huge difference whether or not you're doing React Redux or doing Angular with NGRX or NGXS. And so the Redux pattern itself is a common pattern you can apply to lots of different technologies. So let's take a look at the NGRX pattern. And it really starts with the store. So you have this object called a store that contains the state, your data that you're going to be working on inside your application. And to prevent you from just making mutable soup, what the pattern does is restrict how you make changes to that store. That's it. That is the key concept. You can only make changes to that store in a constrained, defined way so you can keep track of when those changes are made. And you get these great things like those Redux DevTools that you can capture the state and fast forward and rewind through that state. So if I want to make a change to something in my store, and here's a store that's got a list of companies and contacts. What arrays? First of all, I need to display that inside my application. So I select from the store into my application. In this case, we're talking Angular, so we're selecting from the store into our component. If I want to make a change to that store, I can't just change it in that component. I can't make modifications to that list of companies. I have to raise an action. So I raise an action out from the component, and the action is a little class that has a type and a payload. So raise that action and tell the framework, I'm going to fire this action. That action gets accepted by something called a reducer. And in this platform, the reducer is a pure JavaScript function. It takes input in and modifies the state. So then the reducer function operates on the store, and that's the thing that changes the data in the store. And then because the selector is coming back through, that'll update the view in the component. So one thing that's important to note here is these arrows are actually observables inside Angular. So they're streams of data listening to change the state. You push from the reducer into the store, the component will automatically fetch that data via its selector and update the display. So this is kind of the pure NGRX view. So one thing about reducers, because they're pure functions, they're not allowed to have any side effects. They're not allowed to accept any third parties. They can't make a change to the database, for example. They just take the input in, which is the action and the current state, and put the output out, which is the new state. So if I want to have something with a side effect, I need to raise an action, but instead of that action being handled by a reducer, it goes off to a side effect first. So NGRX has a concept of side effects. The side effect runs, and that can take in a service, which, for example, is my database. So that can then perform some database work, and the effect can take in services, dependencies, but it can't change the state. So the way that after we've done a database operation, if we want to change the state, we throw another action that goes out to the reducer. So for example, I have a login action that will go and connect to my login service and log me in. And if that's successful, it will raise a login success action, which will then go to the reducer, and that will update the state in the store. But the reducer can't take in that third-party dependency because it has to be a pure function. So once that those two actions have passed, you've got a login request, connects to my login service or a database, forms a login success action coming through, and that will then update my store. So once you get this concept of it happens in a loop, there's this circle of state in one place, display in one place, and to me, this is very, very similar to the MVC model. MVC has this model, like the actions are pretty much like the controllers, and the view is the component in this example. Okay, so let's talk about, let's introduce the pattern. So what you have now is two options. Happens every time I close down the... For some reason, the piece of software used most on projectors, PowerShell, is the one that messes around with your display settings the most. It's ridiculous. So what I'm going to talk about today mostly is your two options of how you go about implementing Redux in Angular. So your first option is NGRX. And NGRX is the one that's been around the longest and is that pattern. And what I'm going to show you here, if you go to, this is the NGRX GitHub, and what they've got here is something called the example app. And as NGRX updates, then they update this example app to show you all the best patterns and practices for using NGRX. So the other thing I'm going to show you is a brand new application. It's called NGXS. So NGXS is a kind of replacement, a drop-in replacement for NGRX. And it's been out a couple of months, and it's changing very quickly. But one of the reasons for it is people find that with NGRX, there's a lot of boilerplate. And by boilerplate, I mean, remember that loop we saw? You've got to write, to do one simple change, you've got to write lots of bits of code. I've got to write an action, I've got to write a reducer, I might have to write a side effect, and a lot of code. And there's a lot of wiring to get all that wired up in NGRX. So NGXS is a kind of second attempt at giving you the Redux pattern in Angular with some of that framework stuff handled for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to side-by-side compare various operations inside NGRX and NGXS. So we're going to start with how you go about defining your states. How do I say this is the data I'm going to be working with? And in both cases, you declare a TypeScript class. And here's an example of that class in NGRX. You declare an interface, and you say, here are the values of my interface. And you can then specify an initial state as well. So in this case, all you do is create a class, but then you've got to do quite a bit of work to wire this up into the system. There's an index file you can't see here. To get NGRX to pick up this thing as a state, you've got to do some back-end wiring. So let's take a look at how we do that in NGXS. So in NGXS, you pretty much start with a very similar thing. You've got this class. But NGXS works through having these attributes. So it's much more like Angular. If you want to create a component in Angular, you use a component attribute. If you want to create a service in Angular, you use a service attribute. So in NGXS, rather than having all these classes and then wired up by hand, you've got this addition of these decorators to tell you to wire up stuff for you. So this piece of data here just says, okay, set me up a piece of state and give it a name and a default value. So this name here is important. This has to be unique. So remember, the store is a global store of data. We can add as many pieces of state we want to that store with a unique name. So the key difference here is some classes that are wired up manually versus some classes with these decorators that are then picked up by the framework and wired up for you. So next thing I'm going to show you is how to actually get the store into your components. And in both cases, it's pretty much the same. Same as anything else in Angular, you inject into the constructor of your component. So there is NGRX, and we're injecting a store into our component, and here's NGXS. We are also injecting a store into our component. So very similar concepts, similar code, very pretty much exactly the same thing. How you do it in NGRX and NGXS is the same in this circumstance. Okay, so the next thing I want to do, we've injected the store into our component. Let's do that select step. So I want to take some data from my store and display it inside my component. And the way we do that in NGRX is to, if I find the right one, select. So we've got this select command against things that come through. So we do store.pipe and then call select on it. So that's our store that gives us access to all the data. We then pipe that through to a select command, and that select command can take a fat arrow function, or in this case, some predefined fat arrow functions. So use the select command to get stuff from our store into our component. And in NGXS, we've got a little bit more sort of platform configurability here. We've got the concept of this select attribute. So rather than having this stuff manually wired up in code, we've got this attribute. So we can say, okay, we're going to select this type. Now, as you can see, there's a few things they've done here. There's a number of ways of actually addressing that piece of state from the store. I can select it by its class name, and it will actually, look at that class name and turn that into the name. So that class name needs to line up with the name we declared. So if you remember in here, we declared a name for our piece of state. Then we can select using our class that matches that name. We can select using the name of the thing we declare, or we can select using a manual fat arrow function. Now, every time I see a piece of JavaScript kind of functionality where they have multiple ways of doing something, I start to smell bad, because the reason there's so many ways of getting this data out is because the way they've made this select statement is it's not type safe. This object you're getting here from the store is of type any. So you've got all these useful ways of getting it out, but none of them are type checked. So that stinks a little bit. Okay, so we've selected from our store into our component. Let's take a look at the next thing you want to do, which is declaring actions. So I want to raise actions against the store. How do I declare an action? Well, in both cases, it's just a pretty simple class. So we create a class, and all classes in both NGXS and NGRX, we have to specify a type, and that type has to be a string. The reason types have to be a string is because we're dealing with type JavaScript on the compile time. So we can't, like in C# go, oh, is it this type or is it this type? We have to look at a string. So the pattern in NGRX is to declare a bunch of fixed strings and then set that type in our class. So we've got an action that has a type and a payload. So now we can say, I'm going to perform the login action, and here's the data you need to perform that login. In NGXS, it's pretty much the same thing. We have a type, a class with a type. And if you want to add metadata, it's a class with a type and a constructor for the payload. And the difference is with NGXS, there's no actual action attribute to override. So we've declared an action. What do we do next? Well, the next thing we want to do with an action is dispatch it. And so dispatching is the purpose of you build this action, saying I want to perform this thing. I want to tell the framework to run that action. And in both cases, the key word for that is dispatch. This.store.dispatch, the login action. And in NGXS, pretty much the same. We go this.store.dispatch, new action. Now there's one thing NGXS does that NGRX doesn't, and that is this bit at the end of declaring my action. We've got this subscribe on the end of an action of a dispatch. So in NGXS, the dispatch command will run that command and then also return me an observable at the end so that I can respond just to the result of that action. And that action has a life cycle system. It can go, it hasn't run yet, it's running, it's complete successfully, it's failed. In NGRX, you don't have that. You have to run an action, and if you want to see the result of that action, you have to put state in the store and listen to the store coming out. In NGXS, you can actually subscribe directly to an action dispatch. So sometimes, if there's data you're putting into the store just to track the result of an action, you can get rid of that in NGXS and just listen directly to that particular action step. So the final thing I'm going to show you is how you then go about implementing those actions. So in NGRX, you've got two types of operations. You've got a reducer. So remember, the reducer is something that performs a state. So here's a pure function. It's taken in our initial state, and it's taken in our action. And then you can see that what we do here is switch on the action type, and if it was the login type, we perform the login operation. If the login was successful, we perform the login successful, and so on. You see, it builds up. But as you get a complicated application, you can see this could build up into quite a big class. The second thing you've got is effects. Remember the side effects where you had to bounce out? Side effects can have services built in. So this looks a little bit like this. You've got an effect, it runs, this one actually connects to a service and performs our login, and then returns an action at the end. So let's take a look at how we do that in NGXS. So NGXS doesn't have this clear distinction between actions and effects. So you want to create an action. Let's start with a simple action. Once again, you've got this concept of an attribute. So you can declare your actions by decorating with this attribute. You don't have to wire it up manually. Then when you perform this action, here's a simple, it basically takes in the previous state from here, and then lets you update the state here. So if I want to do that whole side effect then reducer pattern, well, NGXS is slightly different because what it has is the concept of async actions. So the async actions here can do both. It can take in a third-party dependency, perform some work, and then, once it's complete, set the state. So that's the biggest change. So in summary, you've got two options if you want to go the Redux pattern in Angular. You've got NGRX, which is the original, and have the most, will have the most kind of number of examples on the web and stuff. But NGXS removes some of the kind of strictness, but gives you a bit more wiring for you, a little bit more convention, a little bit easier to wire things up. And it's almost like a version 2.0 of the Redux pattern on Angular. But in summary, the real difference for me, like I said earlier, is it's not which framework you're using, it's whether you're using the Redux pattern or not using the Redux pattern. And you should definitely consider taking a look at the Redux pattern for your next complicated Angular application. I'm out of time, so thank you for listening.
All right. So first of all, thanks everyone for coming again. It's great to see the full house. So my name is Thiago Passos. I'm a solution architect here at SSW. This is my Twitter handle if you want to get in touch. And that's my blog, passos.com.au. The whole thing I'm going to cover today here is in the last post I just published. So if you want to go there and see how it works and get some code sample, it's all there.
But yeah, let's go with this stuff I'm gonna cover today. So I'm gonna talk about Angular and SignalR with real-time applications. So who here has done any real-time before? Cool. Anyone? Does anyone know what SignalR is? Cool. All right. So basically, this technology has been there for a while. It's using WebSockets under the covers, and the way it works is like long polling, right? So instead of hitting the server and getting the response, what it does is it hits the server, it does a handshake with the server, and it keeps that connection open, right? And after that, the server can send message back as often as it wants back to the client, which is pretty good. So this way we can have multiple people connected to the server, and they can talk to each other, and the server will just manage these connections and the message that are gonna send around. So that's how you would do with real time, which is pretty nice. Okay, so as I was saying, cool, I think that's good now. All right, so as I was saying, I created this application with the simple .NET New Angular. It's using the latest .NET SDK, which is a 2.1. And with that, the SignalR, when you create a new application, is already embedded, right? So you don't need to bring any NuGet package whatsoever to this application. It's all there for you. You just need to wire it up or get started. Okay, so I'm gonna show you how to wire this up. But before I get there, there is only one thing that I wanna show you before. So in the server side, you don't need to bring any extra package. But in the client side, in this case, Angular, we do need to bring an NPM package so we can wire it up, okay? So as you can see here, that's a very vanilla SPA template application, and we've got this client app here, which has the whole Angular application in there, all right? So what I want to do here is go to this client app, and I want to bring that NPM package, which is ASP.NET SignalR. So if everything works well, it's going to bring that package, and I can just use it, okay? So hopefully that's not going to take too long, and I'll be able just to go there and put everything together for you. By the way, the application that I started here, it's a brand new one, but I did run npm install first, so we don't do that during the presentation because otherwise it's going to take forever.
Is it from the Nuggets also, or just NPM repository?
So it's just npm here, because the SignalR itself, you don't need to bring from NuGet anymore. It's already in the .NET Core 2.1. So it's already there by default. You don't need to bring extra packages. So I wrote this post about this application that I just wrote, the drinking game. By the way, the whole source code is on GitHub if you want to check. So when I wrote this application, it was a nightmare to put together. So I'm gonna show you how easy it is right now, because beforehand it was very hard. Okay, so I'm just gonna go one step up here and open in Visual Studio Code the whole application, and I'm gonna start wiring it up. Okay, so first thing I need to do, I'm just gonna go quickly here to my blog just so you can see the post, and then you can go there back there if you want. But I've got the whole source code here and a bunch of snippets, so you can just go and use for yourself. But what I need to do first here, I will show you. First, we're gonna create a hub. A hub in SignalR is like a controller, right? Yeah, I'm gonna go over time. Sorry. So a hub in SignalR is like a controller. Okay, so it's an endpoint that you're gonna hit, so you can do that handshaking and you can send message and receive message back. Okay, so I'm gonna create a new hub here called echo hub.cs. I'm gonna paste that snippet that I just copied from my blog. Just gonna grab this namespace here. Okay, so basically what it does here, I've got this echo hub, and I only have a single method in there because the hub itself that inherits from hub already has all the functionalities to connect, to send messages back and all that, okay? So this method here is what I'm gonna call from the client. I'm gonna call the echo method, and the send method in here is what the server is gonna send back to the client, okay? So what I need to do now, I need to write up my startup.cs, which is services at SignalR. Okay, and in here, in the configure, I'm gonna use that SignalR. Okay. And what I need to do there is I need to map that hub that I just created, echo hub, to a URL so I can use it. And I'm gonna put a echo URL. So from the client, when I call this echo, I will be able to do the handshaking and start the communication. All right. So that's pretty much I need to do in the server side. Now I'm gonna go straight to the client, and I'm gonna mess around with my home component. Okay. So ideally, that's not the best place you would do that. You would create a service or something like that to handle that. But just for the sake of demoing, I'm just gonna put it here. All right. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna bring that from ASP.NET SignalR, and because I added the package already, it already recognized here. And what I want here is the hub connection and the hub connection builder. Okay. I'm also gonna add here implements on in it. Okay. Okay. So I need a few things. I need a connection, and I'm gonna put two extra properties there. One for the message that I'm gonna send across, and one for a list of messages. So I can receive that list of messages, and I can bind to my HTML so you can see that happening. All right, so I'm gonna create here, oops, not here, public hub connection. It's a hub connection. I'm gonna create another one called message, which is a string. And I'm going to create another one called message, which is an array of strings, and I'm gonna initialize as blank. Okay. I'm also gonna create here ng on init. As soon as the application gets started, I want to wire up the connection. And the way I'm gonna do this is the hub connection, and I'm gonna initialize that builder that they already brought from the SignalR package. I'm gonna start with a URL, which is mapped in the startup.cs, okay? And I'm just gonna build. Cool, so as soon as I do that, I have the whole thing built for me. I just need to start after that. But before I start, I have to start wiring up a few things, okay? So what I want here is when the method send is called, so if I go back to the hub, when this method send here is called, I want to do something with it. And what I want to do here is I want to get that message that comes back from the server, and I want to push into my array. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, so the other thing I just need to do is start. Okay, but how do I send a message to the server so it can be broadcasted to the all the clients? I need to create a method here called echo. This can be anything really. And what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna get the hub connection, and I'm gonna invoke a method, which in this case here is called echo, which is this one here, right? And the parameter I'm gonna send is this message. Okay, and as soon as I do that, I'm just gonna clear the message so you can see that happening. Okay, so that's pretty much all that I have to do in the component, and I'm gonna go to the HTML now. I'm gonna clear all this up. I'm gonna type as fast as I can so you can have the next session. But basically what I have here, I'm gonna have a input which I'm gonna bind to the message. Oops. All right. I'm gonna have a button, so when I when I click on that button, I want just to call the method echo in the component. And what I'm gonna do here is let message of message. I just wanna bind that here, okay? All right, so that's pretty much what I need to do. I'm just gonna run that now to see if it works. If it doesn't work, you can talk to me after in the hack day, but I'm pretty confident it's gonna work, so let's see. So that's gonna build both the server side and the client side. So I'm just gonna copy this URL, and I'm gonna go to the browser. So hopefully everything is wired up and everything's gonna work. Hopefully. Or not.
There we go.
I'm like 5 minutes over. But the demo didn't count, right? The drinking game, because it was just part of the. Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't count.
Is this Angular 6?
It's not Angular 6. It's whatever comes with the .NET Core 2.1. I'm sure you use the Angular 5 as well. Just FYI. Anyway, so I've got that my component in the home component, and I've got a simple input and an echo button. If I do a test here, it should come here, hopefully, and it does. And it's amazing, hey, because it works. It doesn't prove anything because I could just put in the same list. But let's open another instance of the browser. And now the magic's gonna work, and now you're gonna believe me that this works, right? So I've got two instances. They're both connected to the hub. And what I'm hoping to see here is if I enter a message here and press echo, it should come in both screens, okay? Hello world. So that should work. Cool. So it works. So it's as simple as that to wire up, and from there you can do a bunch of just use your imagination and build a nice real-time application. Okay. So my PowerPoint slides are down because my computer died. So I'm not gonna try to bring that back. So I'm gonna finish here. You can go to my blog, passos.com.au, if you want more resources, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I'm Jernej Kavka, and I'll be building a little bit on top of Barry's presentation. He already touched a little bit on Seek, but I'll go slightly different approach because I already use Seek on my backend, so why not reuse that already? So a little bit about myself. It's already my blog. You can follow me on my blog, jkdev.me. And I'm a software architect at SSW. I specialized in .NET Core, recently 2.1, work with Angular, doing some unit tests, DevOps, and also Microsoft Cognitive Services, so a little bit bots and facial recognition, stuff like that. And sometimes for fun, I'm doing a DevStart ice cubes. They're really good at cooling down drinks. I sometimes do custom cookies. And in the fridge, you can find a cheesecake that I hid today. So that's something for lunch. Although I haven't really expected that many people, so we'll need to split up very granularly. And you can also follow me on Twitter and on GitHub. So you can get all this information later. But let's focus on Angular logs to seek. So the reason why you want that is essentially you want to have all the logs in one place. And well, you can use structured logs, which pushes all the information straight to the seek. I'm actually using JSON log. The reason for that is simple. I already have a backend, and I want to use all the same configurations I already have for Serilog and for seek, and I just want to use that. And the other thing is with structured log, you actually need to open up seek publicly, which may or may not be an option. With JSON log, you don't have to open up anything extra. There's also other alternatives if you don't mind to pay a little bit. Redux is a really good solution for tracking errors. And you also have track.js, which allows you to, just plug it in and it works magically for you. But what I'm talking about is for free, and you can implement it fairly simple. So you can go to JSON log if you want to have more information. The JSON log allows you to do to integrate with log4net, nlog, or Elmar, but they don't say that they also support Serilog for some reason. But they do support Serilog. Does anyone know Serilog? So if you anyone knows .NET Core, .NET. Yeah, so maybe this is going to be more informational about that you should do a combined logging into one place rather than the which technology to use. And seek is a really good place to put stuff into a log, because this is a local seek I have, and I have already played around with some things, and I have here logs from the backend and from the front end all in one place, and then I can see the logs as a one sequence of events rather than looking the backend logs somewhere in the server and front-end logs maybe going straight to the browser and actually executing the code to see the logs. And this is the application I'm going to demonstrate things. It's a really simple app. It's just used to demonstrate what you can do, just show you some ideas really quick for 5 minutes. First one is just to do login, and all it does is it will log information into the seek, so we know, okay, that person attempted to log in. And another one is how can we capture errors with seek. To show you that, I'll just quickly show the code I have. So for log, we have a simple form, nothing special. And page with errors uses a imaginary variable that is set to null. And I'm trying to access a variable that does not exist, and that blows up the Angular application. And we want to actually capture that information somewhere, and then, when the customer has a problem, you can say, yeah, that's the problem, we'll fix it real soon. And our backend, I have already set up Serilog. So think full screen. I have already set up Serilog. If you're more interested about backend logging, I can show you after this talk. But what you need to know is I already have everything set up the way I want it. And from the front end, I just want to add that extra logging so I know a little bit more what's going on. Now, to get started with that, we need in the package JSON, we need to add JSON log. Now I'm cheating a little bit because I already done the npm install for that, so I don't need to install the entire internet with all the lolcats and whatever in that npm folder. I can just carry on. And because I wanted to make this presentation short, I also cheated by just coming out all the code. So we can get faster to the actual coding. So what I'm doing here, as Barry already told us, is we are trying to hook up to the Angular exception handler, the error handler, and later in the bottom, we'll just uncomment those things. We're basically registering that error handler to be used, and then we can capture all the errors. Now, one of the things you should know is some of the people will do console.warn in the examples how to use this. Some will do throw error. Don't listen to them. Use console error. That will do the right thing, because console.warn will just overwrite whatever you had. So in your Chrome, you won't see the error. Throw error will show you in the Chrome browser, but it will lock into your logger twice. So the console.error is the only one that logs the error in your browser and locks into your logger once. So in case you're looking into the tutorials, console.error is the right way to go. So the next step you want to do is you want to set up the lock level, which in this case will be all. And this particular logger wants you to create a AJAX appender. So you can configure how many times and when those logs are actually pushed to the server. So it doesn't push the errors right away, except if there are exceptions. So exceptions are going straight to the server. Informations are basically patched and then sent it off once you have enough messages or there's a timeout. Now the actual configuration is here, and it's really, really simple. You just say to GL, this is my options, please initialize, and here we just start doing logging. So it's really simple to set up. You might notice I'm doing all in app.module. The reason for that is it just makes it easier to demo, but there is a GitHub repository where it gives you a little bit better structure, and I'll show you that. But just for purpose of demo, for demonstrating this logger, I'm having everything in app.module. Now on the back end, on the .NET or .NET Core, all you need to do is install a NuGet package. Now because we're using .NET Core, we're using JSON log ASP.NET Core. If you use the ASP.NET Classic, use the for .NET Classic. This should finish shortly. And to finish this off on the back end, it's super simple. So you might already have this set up. Just a moment. So here we have use course. Does everyone know what course is? So course, in my case, the web application is in a separate place than the API. And in order for them to communicate, because they are on different ports, we need to allow, open up our APIs to be able to be called from different ports or domains. So here I just said allow everyone, but obviously for production you want to specify which specific domains or ports you allow the API to respond to. And the next one is to configure and set up the logger. So you might see here, this is a little quirk with the logger on the backend side. If you just do that or don't set up, instead of showing you the log, it's going to just log %message all the time. I'm working on fixing that issue, but it's a logging, the logging library issue. But the workaround is just to have something in the beginning and it's just going to work fine. And the last part is just to say, for this logger factory, which we have set up here and in the behind the scenes, it's our Serilog. It could be any other logging system that ASP.NET Core is supporting. We initialize that logging adapter, and then we just push in the JSON configuration we wanted. To test this out, and that's all you need to do to do the simple logging. So one also benefit from that is it doesn't only log in seek. If the Serilog has set up to log it into file, it is going to log also in file. Ah, that's interesting. I'm using .NET Core 2.1 RC, so maybe that was one of the problems. So whatever you set up in Serilog on the server side, it will use that. So if you have a rolling file logs, it's going to log in the files. So you'll have the logs of your front end on multiple places. It could be even in Windows Event Handler, which is what is Windows Event Service? The one that you have in the Windows built in. And more places where you actually usually log only the backend parts. And now you have Angular parts as well. So that can be really powerful when you try to figure out what went wrong with your application. And succeeded. And in the backend, I already had ngserve, so the application has been updating. And right now, I'll press F12 so we can see our logs. I'll refresh that. And now when I press this page with the error, if we go to seek, if everything works fine, we have the same error that was reported on the browser we have in the seek. Now, you can then extend your logger to have, okay. You can extend your logger to have like the location of where that happened. You can have more metadata about the issue, but right now I'm just logging the error. And the place you needed to do that is in the unhandled exception handler. And you can even create your own logger service to basically add more data. And just one more thing to show you regarding the logging. So here we have a logging component. And here we have normal logs. Now what I can do is I can just log it as a string, or I can say, actually, I just want to log this as a object. And I'll say email, and I'll say action as login. And what this will happen is, let's go back, login, ssw.com.au, and when we log, we go back to seek, and here we have essentially, I didn't refresh, sorry. Forgot to save. Oh no, it hasn't compiled yet. Logging, and so now we have structured logs. Now there's a little bit more effort to get those structured logs into as a properties as a seek, and I'm working on a blog to improve that. But this is, you don't have to make any changes on the front end. This is just a change on the back end you need to do to have actual structured logging. And just to finish this off, if you're interested in to have a better log system than this, I have actually created on my GitHub a way to separate this as a service. So instead of having everything in app component, you have actual log service that you can then dependency inject all this stuff. You have, it's completely configurable, and you can actually replace the JSON log with something else if you find something better, like structure seek. If you find that to be better, you can just reuse that. And that's pretty much all. I hope you learned something, and thanks for watching.
My name's Anthony Miller. I'm a software developer. Been developing Angular 2 plus applications for the last 2 years. I got on board pretty early on in the piece, and there was a steep learning curve back then where there wasn't a lot of resources. I actually came to an Angular Hack Day 2 years ago, and that's how I got started myself. So today I'm here going to talk about RxJS. Now, you may know that RxJS is inbuilt. It's the only third-party external dependency in Angular. And as such, there's a bit of a steep learning curve. So I'm going to try and cover some of the basic use cases, and we'll get, basic use cases around that. So before we get started, come on, computer.
The XPS is today not working right.
All right. It's the Camtasia running on it. It's just killing everything on it. So just wanted to let you know that I went to NGConf. If you don't know what NGConf is, it's the world's original Angular conference, and it's held every year in Salt Lake City, USA, Utah. It's a great meeting place where around about 1,500 Angular developers get together over 3 days, various talks and workshops and all of that to learn everything Angular. And what's really great is that you get to hang out with really awesome people. So at NGConf this year and last year, there were only 2 Aussies as the contingency, myself and Duncan Hunter. And if you know Duncan, he used to work at SSW, but now he's gone out and building his own product. So as I was saying, you know, there's really awesome people that you do get to meet. they have awesome parties. So you can see down on the bottom right-hand corner, me in the Back to the Future DeLorean, which was kind of a highlight because I love Back to the Future. But the best thing about the conference this year in particular was that I got to meet Miško Harvey. So if you don't know who Miško is, he's actually the godfather of Angular. He's the guy that is the reason for Angular existing today. So he's the lead, so I call him the godfather. The other cool thing that happened this year at AngularConf is we got cake. And what I mean by that, there was a background story that went that Miško wanted to get the Angular down to under 10 kilobytes in size. So hopefully in version 7 with the Ivy renderer, it will get down even further. So currently uncompressed, it's 36 kilobytes. The cake goal was 10 kilobytes. They managed to, with the Ivy renderer, get a hello world out at 7.3 kilobytes. And when they finally compressed that, it came in at 2.7 kilobytes in size. So there's quite a big size shrinkage from Angular 2 when it originally got released 18 months ago to where they will be in 6 months' time when Angular 7 comes out. So enough about all of that sort of stuff. I mean, Angular conference was really cool and everything, but I'm here to talk about RxJS. So you may know that there's lots and different operators, and it's a big body of work with regards to RxJS. There's creation operators, you know, how you go about creating an observable. You've got transformation operators that take your data from one state to another state by using mapping and things like that. You've got filtering operators where you say, well, I want to only filter these type of events. You've got combination operators that basically allow you to merge different sets together. You've got multicast operators. This allows you to do basically pub/sub type stuff. You've got error handling, you know, where you can catch particular errors that are occurring through your observable chain. You've got conditional and Boolean operators, that's self-explanatory, and mathematical operators like sum and things like that. But today I'm just going to concentrate on one little small part, and this is transformation operators. And this is the number of just transformation operators. There's quite a long list there, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this. I'm basically going to just cover a couple of these items. As such, I'm going to talk about concat map, when to use, exhaust map, merge map, and the infamous switch map. There's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of months around when to use switch map and when not to use switch map. So, demo time. So, everyone can see this, the code base that I've got up here? No? Why?
Apart from you.
I don't know what's happening.
Just press this screen a little bit. Your window. Yeah, now it's showing up.
Is it showing up now?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just...
Get out of the PowerPoint presentation mode.
Okay, that might be it. Don't you just love everything? So you can see code there now. And everyone can read that clearly, or do I need to bump it up one more? Bump it up one more? Control plus. There we go. Is that okay now? So, I mean, this is just a quick little demo that I put together while the other talks were going on because I hadn't done this part. But essentially, all I've got is a basic application. I just scaffolded. I went ng new, created an application. And one of the things that I wanted to be able to do was is to demonstrate, you know, the clicking of event to retrieve data. So what I basically did here is that I get a reference to my button on the screen, and on the ng after view init, I basically just wanted to safeguard, you know, you can do this little check yourself. You don't necessarily need to. Just make sure it's there. Then I create an observable using from event. From event will take basically attaches the event listener for you. So I get the native DOM element. I'm going to respond to the click event, and I'm subscribing to that. So if we go to the web page, and can this be seen okay? So basically what I've got is the ability to go click, and it makes the log call. So over here on the right-hand side, you can see the button click event, and it gets an exclamation mark in there. So I just update the information. Why isn't this? There we go. So all as I'm doing is basically getting the args, and it's going into this thing. So now, one of the most common things as a part of a button click is that we want to go off and get some data. And so if I uncomment out this code, basically I'm using the new pipe operator that came out with RxJS 5.5, and now it's going to be the standard in 6 moving forward. And basically I'm using the switch map operator using the HTTP client class. So that's the way you go off and retrieve data. And all as I'm basically doing is calling this endpoint to go off and get a list of quotes. So if we save this guy and we go back to the demo app, it's rebooting. It says welcome to Angular Hat Day, and it's making a call off to a quotes API and inserting it into that label field. Now, if you think about when you're making an API call, if someone sits here and basically goes, I'm clicking and I'm clicking, I'm clicking and clicking, what does that mean? So I'm using the switch map operator to basically go cancel the previous call, use this next call. So there are different operators and different use cases that you want to be able to do. For fetching data, you may want to use a switch map operator, but when you're going to save data, if you use a switch map operator, guess what might happen? Well, you call one save, now you've got another save, it goes, oh, well, this save is now cancelled, I'll go with this one. So you may or may not want that type of behavior in your application. Another operator might be useful is an operator called exhaust map. Exhaust map is basically says, oh, I'll make a call to the back end, I'll ignore all other calls until this one's complete, and when it completes, then I'll allow new calls to come in. That's another operator. Or you may go, well, actually I want to do a merge map, I want all saves to go through. Well, you know, that may not be good from a consistency point of view in your database, but there might be a use case that you have. And then you've also got another operator called concat map. And so these are the 4 ones that I'm going to show in a little bit more detail, and you'll get a good visual representation of what these actually mean. And so just to cover off concat map, it's just like what you do with an array. You concat values together. So when you make an observable call, it's I will do this one, and you add another one, it will add that in, and it will wait until the first one finishes before it does the second operation. You can keep on concating, and it basically queues them up to be executed. So to demonstrate this, when I was at NGConf, I attended the RxJS workshop by Ben Lesh. He's basically the guy that wrote RxJS as we see it now in version 5. And basically we get some really cool code, and I'm not going to go into the specifics of this, but if we look at the operator switch map, and I just simply refresh this, I'm going to basically drop a ball onto the screen and it bounces down. You know, very simple type of thing. So I'm using the switch map operator here, and as I said before, it's like if you make a HTTP call to the back end and then you use a switch map and I click that button again, it's going to cancel that first one and execute the next one. So if I do that in here, and this is a visual representation so you can really get an understanding of this, is that if I do that, I'll wait for that to finish, and now the other one finished. But see how I'm just clicking ball drop, and it's not finishing until it clicks across to the end. So you can understand, does that kind of give what switch map is doing? You throwing things out there, you're not waiting for it to finish. And so when you make another call, it says, oh, well, I'll ignore that one and I'll make that call and I'll wait for that to finish to get the response. And so that's what the completed thing is there to say, oh, well, that's your complete count. So now if we think about the other operators such as, what's the other one? Concat-map. All right. So if we save this guy and come back over here, so if I click that, you know, it bounces and I'll let that finish. But if I click that twice, oh, why didn't the other one? Oh, there it is. So it adds it onto it. So I just click that again. I can click that 3 times. And so essentially, I'll get 3 balls that are dropping. Now, if I use the other operator, such as exhaust map, and I come back to here, and I go, all right, I'll let that one just make sure that it's still working. But if I click that and I click it again and I click it again, oh, it didn't execute my other ball drops. I said to drop the ball, and that's because while I'm clicking that button, no other calls are going to allow to come through. It's like the gatekeeper. Until that other one, the observable that's currently running is complete, it will not accept any other new instances of that click. It's just the same as if you're thinking about making a HTTP call and you got that save button. Well, the user clicked it. It's just like, well, they clicked it. I don't, you know, nothing else has happened. I'm waiting for that to finish. You know, users always go click, click, click. Why isn't this thing working? Well, you could use exhaust map to basically, you know, as a gatekeeper for your saves. And the other one is merge map. Now, this will give you a really good demonstration of what merge map is attempting. So if I click ball drop, you know, it runs through, just make sure it's still working. I click it now, I click it now, and I click it now, I click it now. And if it doesn't matter, I just keep on clicking it, it's going to keep on dropping them. So it means that all those requests to your backend are all getting fired off, and they're all just being merged together, and they're running asynchronously in parallel. Okay, and so they're all going to complete, you know, if the backend does complete, but it just means that, you know, you've got those different operators that you can get through. So I just got told I got 2 minutes. I don't know how long I've been talking for. So that was the basic demonstration I wanted to show. So if you think about your main application when you're calling switch map, you've got to think about when you're making a backend API call, what do you need to do? What operator is specific for that? So for a get, maybe it's a switch map. It sounds like the best one. Maybe when you're doing the save, it should possibly be an exhaust map. If you're trying to do things in parallel, maybe you think about a merge map. And if you're wanting it to be one after the other, then a concat map will be of use. Some really valuable resources for you to go and look up on the web is for RxJS is ReactiveX. This is actually the home website for RxJS. There's another really cool one called learnrxjs.io. It has some really useful information. You've got RxJS marbles, so rxmarbles.com. That actually shows you as in marble diagrams your observable stream. And there's a really cool article on Medium with Angular in depth that goes through using GIFs to show you how all of these operators work and plus more. Some additional resources that you might find useful as a general shout out for the Angular community is a podcast that's called NGRX. It's done weekly and it's recorded and put up on YouTube. I listen to it religiously every week myself. It's got some really great topics. And another one website is called Medium. I know Thiago loves Medium because he doesn't use it, but it's a really great resource to search for lots and lots of Angular articles. And that's me, so thanks.